So welcome to On the Park Bench, a public square conversation brought to you by the Congress for the New Urbanism. On the Park Bench presents interactive conversations with thought leaders in new urbanism and allied fields related to the built environment. Today we have Trends in Suburban Retrofit with June Williamson and Ellen Dunham-Jones, moderated by myself, Robert Studeville. So share your thoughts on hashtag On the Park Bench, www.tinyurl.com/OTPB-feedback. And join us at CNU 33. CNU 33 will be in Providence, Rhode Island on June 11th through 14th. This year, 2025, this historic port city has stunning architecture and some of the best new urbanism in the United States. We held a CNU there in 2007, and it was fantastic. Much more has happened over the last 17 years, so mark your calendar. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation today with June Williamson and Ellen Dunham-Jones. They are the recipients of this year's Seaside Prize. Seaside Prize will be awarded on February 8th in Seaside, Florida. June Williamson is professor and director of graduate programs in architecture at the Spitzer School of Architecture of the City College of New York, where she has been on the faculty since 2008. A registered architect, she has practiced and taught architecture and urban design across the U.S. Ellen Dunham-Jones is professor of architecture and directs the MS in urban design at the Georgia Institute of Technology, Georgia Tech in Atlanta. She hosts the Redesigning Cities podcast series and was recognized twice by Plan Edison as one of the 100 most influential urbanists ever. But it is with their work together on Suburban Retrofit that that was the reason for awarding the prize to June and Ellen. June and Ellen are co-authors of a pair of award-winning books on retrofitting suburbia. The 2011 book, Retrofitting Suburbia, Urban Design Solutions for Redesigning Cities, changed our understanding of suburban retrofit and suburbia in general, from sort of a certain urban form to one of almost unlimited possibilities. So they followed that up in 2021 with case studies in retrofitting suburbia, urban design strategies for urgent challenges. Both June and Ellen lead workshops with cities and community groups across the United States, and Ellen maintains a database of 2,000 suburban retrofit projects. They are the go-to experts on this subject. The upcoming Seaside Prize weekend will be one of the first symposiums on suburban retrofit, at least featuring, focusing on their work. I'm Rob Studeville, editor of CNU's Public Square. First, there's going to be a discussion with the two panelists, and then we will open it up for questions from the audience. So please use the Q&A function of Zoom to ask your questions as they occur to you. We will get to them more or less in the order they are asked. So welcome, June Williamson and Ellen Dunham-Jones to On the Park Bench, and congratulations on your upcoming Seaside Prize.
Thank you.
So, I'm going to be directing questions to each of you specifically to avoid confusion, but please feel free to chime in, both of you, if you have thoughts, regardless of who the initial person is that I direct the question to. First of all, I wanted to ask about the Seaside Prize, and what are your thoughts on winning this, and talk a little bit about your personal journey to get to this point. June, could you begin?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. So I guess I would broadly say that I, as so many perhaps of you listening, and the majority of Americans grew up, well, majority many Americans grew up in suburban environments. Suburban environments for me in the US. So I spent time in suburbs of New Orleans, suburbs of Boston, suburb of Pittsburgh, but also overseas. So my family, when I was 3, we moved to Saudi Arabia, but we lived in an Aramco compound that had been designed to replicate a kind of oil suburb in Texas with ranch houses, crabgrass, the whole bit. And then later we lived in England, and we lived outside London in Surrey in a very suburban, so an Anglo-American kind of suburban access. So having that upbringing and then going to architecture school where the expectation was to kind of shed all of that and becoming a sophisticated urbanist was to be aligned with cities, which I did not mind at all broadly, but I still puzzled over my many of my instructors, Ellen Dunham-Jones accepted, because she did become my instructor in graduate school in architecture. But there was this kind of reflexive dismissal of suburbs and suburban environment, and by extension, suburbanites. And I didn't disagree about the what, because I'd lived it, the sprawl, the pollution, the transportation and mobility restrictions, the consumption, the exclusion, and so forth. But I wondered about the why. So part of the problem was like this refusal to even see suburbia not simply as a static foil for cities, but as a dynamic, diverse set of places to which our architects and designers could be engaged and really change those places that were full of struggle and strife. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. But then starting to work with Ellen and encountering resistance for kind of taking on this topic as something worthy of study and attention. And Ellen, maybe you want to take it from there.
Sure, I will. Yeah. I mean, I also grew up in New Jersey, the most suburban state, and seeing sprawl just starting to also destroy. My first teaching job was at University of Virginia, and beautiful countryside outside of that. You just felt like you could hear the bulldozers. So I became interested. I started off critiquing sprawl, like one of just many academics. But it was coming to CNU and hearing talks by folks like Victor Dover and some of Peter Calthorpe's work and others that were showing these projects that were retrofitting suburbia. And I got super excited. I was like, that's really why I joined CNU. I was interested in that aspect in particular of the charter. And yet also realized that I thought these projects were super important, but knew they weren't getting published in the design architecture magazines. They weren't considered sexy enough at the time. And so that was really when I kind of thought, I want to document these projects and just share them, try to share them with a broader audience, even beyond CNU. And that was really the start. I asked June to help me, and it's kind of, we've gone on from there.
What are your thoughts on the Seaside Prize, and what does this mean to win this at this point? I guess 13 or 14 years after you came out with the book, and how do you feel about that, and the weekend and the symposium that's coming up, June?
Well, I'll say first of all, the hardback edition of the book was 2008. So 2011 is when the
Oh,
paperback
well,
version.
excuse me. I was
Okay.
relying on Google and didn't have a good.
So there's a sort of longer history, and then it even goes back to what was the year of the issue of Places that we co-edited? Was that 2004?
I think I was, yeah, around 4 to 6, somewhere in that range.
So we count it as 20 plus years at this point, publishing on this topic. But just, it goes without saying, perhaps, but I'll say it, receiving the Seaside Prize is incredibly gratifying and affirming for all the work that we've done, and starting out nerding out on the sidelines and really seeing the periphery, in a sense, become the center. This is really where our future, our urban future, our urbanism future in Northern America certainly will be forged. And it's a critical time too to make policy changes, interventions, to recognize opportunities, really, as a lot of the sort of post-World War II environments have kind of come past age, I guess. And so it's really very, very timely. But we're so excited too about the opportunity to bring folks together to be in conversation with us over the prize weekend. Really, really excited.
Yeah, I looking back on the history as well, I'll just say while June and I were writing the book, we knew there was a small group of other wonky types like us who, we knew there was a small audience, but we did not at all expect that the book would be read by that many people, let alone have the impact it has. So it's a tremendous validation to have the Seaside Prize and to really be able to also welcome these other scholars. So it's not only going to be June and I speaking, but we will have quite a lineup of terrific other speakers coming in.
Yeah, the idea of transforming the suburbs and changing them into something different really seemed to have an appeal beyond the urbanist audience, to a broad audience. And there was a lot of media attention, as I recall, when the book came out. I mean, why do you think that was? June, why did this connect with so many people?
Well, I think broadly it's demographics. So while cities are dynamic and exciting places, suburbs are well, they're more diverse and exciting and differentiated than the stereotypes suppose. And I think there's an odd kind of disconnect there, where people live in these diverse suburbs, but they consume and will reflect back this kind of stereotype that isn't even their own experience, that they've seen mediated in film and television, and exported, in a sense, across the globe. But I think it's kind of, I lost my thread a little bit there, but I think that because of that connection that most people have personally, and with, whether it's shopping malls, certainly growing up, my own sort of baby boomers, and then Gen Xers like myself, and also subsequent generations have had that lived experience. And while the percentage of the US population that's lived in center cities has remained about a third of the population, so that leaves 2/3. The majority of that remaining 2/3 live in suburbanized environments. So I think it just really resonates. It's controversial too. People have very strong feelings about these places, and so that moves it into, I think, a more general conversation. But what we contribute is real knowledge about the kinds of changes that are actually possible and have been realized in a way that maybe people who aren't involved in the design and development and construction and planning field might not be aware of as even possible.
And there's rural sprawl too. I mean, like, it's really the same forms have taken over in rural places as well, and in cities too. But Ellen, what do you think about the popularity of the subject?
Well, I think we really have always focused, we don't care about the municipal designation of whether something is a city, is a sub. I mean, the way suburbs are defined by the census is just sort of absurd anyway, or rural. We care about the form. So there's urban form, which is more walkable and buildings face the street, blah, blah, blah. And suburban form, where it's a object building surrounded by parking lots or lawn, and you can, and curly Q street patterns and all of that. So the form, yes, we want to retrofit suburban form regardless of the municipal
Yeah, wherever it is found.
Yeah. And what we also found, and certainly as we started being invited to give lectures to communities, is, city council people would come up to us and say things like, when I became a city council person, of my suburban town, I went to the library to try to find books that would help me. No, all the books are on downtowns. There's just, and folks would say, yours is the first book that helped me imagine change, so that the change agents aren't usually educated in the design fields. And so we always try to show before and after. And the befores, because of the nature of suburban development, tend to be very recognizable. Everybody knows what that dead big box, that dead gas station site, whatever, parking lot sites are. And then we show what it's possible, what has been built, what someone has been able to change. And that just sparks a lot of imagination and help for, I think, those folks in communities who are trying to improve their communities.
I will
Ellen,
add one thing. Can I just add one thing to what Ellen's saying? She's, is absolutely spot on. I think one of the things that maybe that's a little bit lost in the conversation because of this kind of oppositional framing, cities versus suburbs, density versus, sprawl for some, or really wonderful American dream neighborhoods for others, is that our argument for retrofitting involves, in some cases, densifying, redevelopment, making more stuff in certain locations, but also regreening. So in the larger term, it's about kind of moving the density around, and there may be locations where a retrofit might involve lowering the density, recreating natural open space, so that it isn't always about taking a site and putting more there. You sort of, it's balancing and looking at things more regionally to increase efficiency, unlock opportunity, make things perform better environmentally. So I think that's something that sometimes is a mischaracterization of our work, that it's, and maybe of CNU more generally, that it's always about adding density, right, in all locations, and it isn't.
Ellen, you maintain the database, and so I was wondering what are the current trends. A lot of people are seeing what's happening with the suburbs in their local communities. They also may have these are designers, may have projects, but these are often anecdotal, and we don't, there's no Department of Commerce statistics that come out on the suburbs that really we see very much, or the changes in the suburbs. So I'm sure people are curious as to what the current trends are and how they have changed since you've been tracking this.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give just a really brief, because I could talk for hours on this. So, but for one thing, there are just so many. When we wrote the first book, June and I had 80 case studies, and really the database now is up to 2,500. And that's the tip of the iceberg. I can't keep track of them all. I'm going to retire so I can update the database. But the trends that we are that definitely are seeing are, on the one hand, tremendous, real, whether you're talking the malls, the office parks, the corridors, there's just an emphasis on going from indoors to outdoors, kind of post-pandemic. So whether it's, experiential retail, as malls are closing, a lot of retail really wants to be along a sidewalk in a more urban, walkable condition. We see a lot more town greens are absolutely essential in every mixed use development. And even in some of the ones that they don't necessarily have residential, but there's still a mix of uses, the amenity decks. Trail oriented development is a very big thing. Fairly recently, it's been built, certainly been building. So anything that kind of gets people, whether it's out of their cars or out of buildings, is kind of a general response, I think, to work from home. These are seen as amenities to have access. They're also a response to the labor shortage. So if you want to be able to hire folks, you have to you want to have your workplace, if you want them to come into work, has to have some of these outdoor amenities and new ways to get around. I think June's going to talk a lot more about affordable housing, but housing is absolutely what the one thing that everyone is really trying to build. Municipalities are really caught between, on the one hand, they know they need to, and they not always, want to address the need for affordable housing, but they also really don't want to change the zoning away from commercial because they want the tax revenue from the commercial. And so there's a lot of sort of tug of war debates on that. But I think also really what we're seeing, construction costs have just gone up the roof. Every project type is kind of struggling. And so we're seeing a lot of plans of, there's going to be another mall mixed use development, another office park that's going to have more, be infilled with more housing, or we're seeing outside of Atlanta now in the affluent suburbs, we're seeing 20 to 25-year-old office buildings that were built at 400 a square foot back then being demolished because there's just too much suburban office project out there, and they want to build housing with these in more walkable mixed use places. So the office parks are today's dying office parks, are sort of yesterday's dying malls. They're both continuing on, but I'd see a lot more plans than I really see construction and build out. And this is true throughout all of the architecture profession this year. More billings were from adaptive reuse than from new construction. And so it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. I think the other new, really interesting trend, like when we wrote the first book, and even still in the second book, so much of retrofits were focused on aging commercial property. Very little change in the residential neighborhoods. They are static tissue, and yet with missing middle, we're starting to see a lot more. We're even change bit by bit going into residential neighborhoods. Again, being, so there's just a lot of changes. Corridors are still a big deal. Light rail transit, less so, a lot more bus rapid transit, a lot of micro transit. So there's constantly little shifts. And I think the regulatory world has been interesting to continue to watch the role. We're seeing states overriding local zoning. It'll be interesting. Who knows what's going to happen over the next 4 years?
Let's talk about housing a little bit more, June. And I mean, housing is at the center of our real estate conversation and planning conversation everywhere, and of course the increase in housing prices. And is this really changing the conversation in suburban retrofit, and how?
Yeah, I think that's a huge and very important question right now. I think as we look at the landscape and the needs that are so pressing across all, I think, demographics and regions of the country, for a whole host of factors that we can point to. I think one thing I want to say before diving into that is, I hope everybody who's listening today is aware of our second book, Case Studies in Retrofitting Suburbia, which is a completely new book. So it's not a revised edition of the first book. And we really have a lot more examples. I'm starting to see some questions in the Q&A about examples. And, the answer is, for some of the examples is questions are, yes, we've seen those examples. We've seen all kinds of examples of different kinds of uses being put in different contexts. I will say, though, two things are sort of constants certainly for us to be interested in documenting an example. One, which is one of the first urgent challenge in our new book, the subtitle, the newer book, is Urban Design Strategies for Urgent Challenges. And the first is about disrupting automobile dependence. And I don't think it can be stressed enough, the kind of intersection of transportation or transit options and mobility with housing and housing affordability. So these things really go hand in hand. And I would say that the second sort of emergent constant in many of the retrofits we've seen is the introduction or inclusion of some housing component in the retrofit, especially if there's any new development or new construction involved. With some of what we call re-inhabitation projects, it actually might be going from a commercial use to a more community serving sorts of use. So going from the private to more of a public sector use without adding density. So, if you haven't checked out the new book, I do encourage you to, because there are many new in-depth case studies framed around these 6 challenges of disrupting automobile dependence, improving public health. And I think this is a huge area where there might also be some funds and support and some research based in data, supporting an aging population. And that really gets at housing too, because part of what could happen is for folks who are basically occupying much more space in their dwelling than they really need, they could unlock that space, all the vacant bedrooms, millions of vacant bedrooms across the continent. If they could move there was a place for folks to downsize to, then that would unlock some houses. And then leveraging social capital for equity. And I think this is a really important one, because people think automatically a redevelopment is going to be a gentrification or displacement. And there are policy tools that can be put in place around that, competing for jobs and adding water and energy resilience. So how does this all circle back to housing? I think what we're seeing here is a real this is hinged to this idea of conversion of commercial use, right? So certainly we're seeing the allowance of accessory dwelling units, or the rolling back of kind of the R1 housing that would lock neighborhoods into one dwelling per lot kinds of systems. So accessory dwelling units or second units, or maybe taking individual lots that are well located and allowing them to have more than 2 units. So three units, or putting in the missing middle, 3, 4, or 5 units and putting in the missing middle is happening. That's very incremental. So really looking at corridors, I think, is a huge trend here, and being able to key that to affordability, right? So if you're less dependent on a car, there's ways to make people's incomes stretch further and burden them less with high costs of transportation and housing. I think there's some really interesting studies that are being done. And this is, we do case studies, but there are other scholars who are really using data analysis in a sophisticated way to look at all the inventory using GIS or using urban footprint tools to really look over a large area and kind of identify not just vacant properties, but places that there's an interesting study being done in San Antonio by Professor Ian Kane at the University of Texas, San Antonio. SOM Prize funded research looking at 7 BRT corridor routes in the metropolitan area, and using sophisticated data scraped from credit card use and cell phone data to not only identify vacant lots, but also what he's calling low commercial output lots. That's based on the sales data, and low intensity parcels based on the cell phone data to try and identify retrofitting opportunities along these corridors to try and meet the 500,000 new housing units that Metro San Antonio expects to to need. Similar studies being done by academics at Florida Atlantic University, looking at Fort Lauderdale. And of course, Peter Calthorpe has been doing this in California. And a lot of this is inspired by some studies that were done by the Metropolitan Planning Organization of Boston, MAPC, to look at 3,000 strip malls in the Boston metropolitan area. And I think you wrote about this, Rob, that if 10% of the best located strip malls were redeveloped with housing, that could add almost 125,000 new housing units to Boston. So one piece of this is just trying to think about how land use and affordability or opportunity are linked. So I'm really excited about those kinds of studies. And of course, once you're on a BRT line or so forth, then you can be addressing that reduction in automobile dependency half of the equation. So looking at corridors, super, super exciting. And I will say that the MAPC research was inspired by a talk that I gave there a couple of years prior. So I think the case study kind of work we've done, Ellen and I, with the before and afters, really helps communicate that these changes are possible. And then that can encourage this more systemic research, I think, to be done to point to the specific opportunity locations in any metropolitan area. So I hope that's making some sense to folks. And I think that there's a huge area here from like subsidized affordable housing, which is incredibly difficult, definitely has a place, and policy can help make sure that when new opportunities arise, that subsidized affordable housing component must be included in any project. But there's also this way to find out how to bring the cost down of for lack of a better phrase, of the market rate kind of housing in communities that's been so constrained by zoning and restrictions, and also by ideology, I guess, or these persistent stereotypes that need to continue to be punctured, I would say.
Well, the capacity along these corridors, especially, is really astonishing when you start to examine it. Even just like you said, like 10% along some of these corridors, the numbers you can get for housing really are amazing and could provide all of the 4.5 million housing units that we need, that we supposedly have a shortage of nationwide. But Ellen, uh, you know, that's kind of the promise, but are these suburban sites, especially these corridor sites, are they living up to that? Are there problems, actually building housing on these corridors?
It's happening, but it is very piecemeal. So it happens. Well, it happens in incremental phases. So one of the projects in our the case studies book here, is the very first one is Aurora Avenue in Shoreline, Washington, which started with, all right, we're going to put in a BRT line, and we're going to underground the utilities while we do that and slightly change. So that's pretty expensive. Then they also put in a trail connection. Well, that triggered the redevelopment of what was a former Sears, sort of a standalone Sears. That has already now become mixed income apartments with plans for a lot more redevelopment coming along around that. So we're starting to see that, yes. So in that case, that was a sort of bus rapid transit and complete street corridor to a certain degree. There, I don't even remember. Do you remember, June, when they started planning that one? How long it took? I mean, it's just these things. The corridors end up taking a very long time to see change. A lot of Dan Burden's work on corridors. Certainly, there's some really great examples, but they. I'd love to find somebody who figures out how do we make them, are there ways to make it happen faster? But lots and lots of proposal, we are seeing housing coming in. And I think in particular, because we're seeing that the big box in general is one of the retail types that is doing the worst. They just can't compete with the internet. And so much of the strip mall, corridor, big box retail is not doing well. Retail tends to do better when it's got critical mass. And so the proposals generally to say, all right, let's cluster those corridors retail at the intersections, or at least at some sort of a center. It might not be at an intersection, but then you can really line the rest of it in great ways. So, and even in our first book, we did a great study of Cathedral City, California, where the city took ownership of not very far, a mile or two, of the what had been a state highway, made it a multi-way boulevard, which is pricey, but put the high-speed traffic through the middle, put the slower local traffic that was now on to support their newly built rebuilt downtown alongside it, and lots of palm trees, and it really made an absolutely beautiful retrofit. We documented that one in the first book. I was hoping I'd see a lot more examples of that. Haven't seen many more. It's expensive to do. So anything, the retrofits, the corridor retrofits like Boulevard, BLVD by Moulin Palazoides, are really smart. They did not change curb and gutter. So they just, by keeping all the sewer underground stuff, then it's really just a sort of surface job. And in that case, they moved the parking to the middle, did put in new paving that's permeable, reflective paving, and street trees and street lights. An absolutely beautiful project. And I do see a lot more proposals of folks trying to do that. So there's a wide range out there. And we are, I think with California, with California's AB 2011, the state bill, I'm expecting we're going to see a lot of those that now allow, by right, the state is overriding local zoning control along corridors if you are putting in affordable housing. And then he's hoping that then that affordable that is all served, also complemented with autonomous shuttle bus transit along, so that is car-free housing along the corridors.
We're going to get to some Q&A, and I have more questions. Maybe I'll get to those or maybe not. But I wanted to remind everybody to, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. So Dwayne asked, how can retrofitting strategies simultaneously address the environmental, social, and economic challenges of suburban sprawl without exacerbating inequalities, gentrification, or market-driven exclusions? June?
I'll take that. Well, part of it is policy and getting ahead of it, and having productive conversations when the pressure of redevelopment is occurring. And one new book that I would point to is called The Right to Suburbia, Combating Gentrification on the Urban Edge by Willow Lung Amam. I recently reviewed this book along with a fabulous new book by Becky Nicolaitis called The New Suburbia, How Diversity Remade Suburban Life in Los Angeles after 1945. That's a history book. Those two together. And there's also an interesting book by Tim Keogh about Long Island, so in the New York area, called In Levittown's Shadow. And these three books really do tackle that question. I think part of how we want to shift this is thinking about where is displacement? Where's the risk of displacement? And I think that's a really key factor to focus in on when there are retrofitting projects or processes that seem to be in place. So in our new book too, in the section where we look at social equity, I think there's some really interesting case studies there where community groups working with faith-based groups trying to forge allegiances with local elected officials so that when new infrastructure or other kinds of benefits are coming to a community, that there's a productive conversation about how that might roll out rather than the kind of fear that could lead to actually rejection of these needed investments because there's a sense that gentrification and displacement will inevitably follow. Instead, there's the opportunity to get needed benefits, parks, plazas, sewers, other kinds of things into the communities. And retrofits can have community serving uses and spaces reserved for them in the projects. So I think that's a really key piece of it.
I'll just piggyback on and basically say, your question, how can you simultaneously address these issues? Read our book. That's exactly how we laid it out, was that there are all these challenges and showing how different projects they're not all addressing all of them, but they're always addressing multiple. And that's the biggest change from the first book to this book. The first book was only about what can you do for reducing auto dependency. Everything now is we have to be smarter, and that's why we wrote the second book. We thought, wow, these projects they're more ambitious, and we want to tell their story.
Diane asks, in most suburban retrofit, old shopping mall complexes are retrofitted to housing projects or some other form of commercial development. Have you seen or could you share case studies or examples where the retrofit is to be a public facility use, such as schools or a library or community centers? I know that you have many of these examples in your book and perhaps both of your books. Who wants to take it?
I'll give just a quick. So yes, Diane, lots of examples of the reuse and what we call the re-inhabitations. So in the first book, one of them happened to be a dead mall that was extended on top with a community college. That then inspired in Austin, Texas, when the Highland Mall died, Austin Community College was looking for more space. And initially they just bought the JCPenney. Then they ultimately bought the whole mall. And so now you've got a community college operating in the mall. They partnered with a local developer who has been building housing and office on the parking lots, at the same time as they've been regreening a lot of those parking lots, and in particular commemorating a former slave, an encampment of former slaves that had been on the site. So, the role when you get that's just one example. Oh, and it's at a new transit stop. So the transformations can be really inspiring.
Stan asks, have you come across successful office to residential conversions in the suburban examples that you have reviewed? This is a bigger trend now. The office parks are in need of retrofit. And for a long time, we were talking more about malls than office parks. June, what are your thoughts about the office to residential conversions?
Well, so back in 2008, we had some examples of what was that one in Minneapolis area, Ellen? I'm forgetting.
Skyloft.
Skyloft, yeah, and there were financial issues with that redevelopment, but it was a kind of low slung middle, was it 6 to 8 story office building with parking around it converted to residential lofts. I think this is a huge opportunity area. So there have been many articles about the desire, but also the complexity and cost of converting a downtown high-rise office building into apartments. And a few of them have happened here in Manhattan where I live, and you have to cut an atrium and great expense to do it. But the value of the property, the opportunity makes it in some cases perhaps a viable proposition. But the opportunities are vast in these sort of Class B, Class C office buildings in peripheral settings. So you already have a building with infrastructure, elevators, so forth. And by kind of reskinning it, maybe pushing in and making terraces and so on, so you can deal with the large floor plate issue, but in a low-rise building where the construction type is more flexible and forgiving, and then also perhaps add things onto the site as well to make a more coherent kind of residential development. Really, really a huge opportunity area. So we've seen some examples even going back 20 years, and I do expect to see more of those. And I think some of them could be turned into dormitories, or, there's this new, I think, shared housing with unrelated adults looking to economize and also to combat loneliness. So rather than kind of small shoebox studios for everywhere, you have to also have your own kitchen and pay for all your own kind of utilities and so on. Pooling resources and finding ways for people to live together, perhaps while they're young adults, but also older adults are seeking this as well in a kind of co-housing kind of format, I think is really conducive to a retrofit of a suburban kind of mid-rise office building. So I expect to see more of those. And Ellen made the point earlier that Architects Billings is much more about adaptive reuse. And this is a really, really attractive adaptive reuse proposition, I would say.
I want to also add that what I think is what I'm seeing a lot of are now developers going into older office buildings, suburban office sites that have a lot of surface parking, and they're building a garage, putting in a lot of housing, and then sharing the parking with the office, and really making it mixed use, and even just letting the office be office, but now really transforming that and starting to really do a lot of that at scale.
And that can make the office leases more attractive because folks are living there. There might be a cafe. It could just make the whole environment more attractive for the employers and employees as well.
So David asks, in the past, there were itinerant vendors who would park their truck in a given space one day each week and sell produce, fish, meat, clothing, or whatever to people in rural and semi-rural areas. Are you seeing this appear in suburbs? You may have an idea or may have a need. Are you seeing anything like that in your suburban retrofit? Ellen?
The closest I would say, I'm not, if it doesn't make the news, I probably don't hear about it. So, I rely mostly on local newspaper stories that are talking about development to find projects. So no, I'm not seeing a lot of that, but I do know certainly, Food Truck Fridays, and it's that kind of thing. And I do think actually we're going to just see more and more of with some of the use of autonomy and drones to deliver all sorts of things. Supposedly Walmart can deliver you a hot rotisserie chicken by drone in 30 minutes. And I think we're just seeing a whole range of, explosion of how and where we'll get our food. But yeah, in general, I mean, the trucks is kind of interesting because I do think another trend is that retail footprints are shrinking in general. And so the food and beverage has been growing, but who knows? I don't know where I'd love to see more small vendor space. I mean, I do think, Mashpee Commons was one of the very first retrofits of a strip mall by Dwani Pluter-Zyberg, had liner buildings that were deliberately too narrow, only 25 feet deep, to screen the parking lots so that they could still create the experience of walking down an urban double-sided retail street at Mashpee Commons. So those little liner buildings were specifically for local retail because they knew the chains would never rent there. And they were actually, I know, was told by Doug Storrs at a CNU that actually it was those local retailers that during the recession carried them through.
I would also say, though, you frame this as rural or semi-rural. I think it's always been suburban, right? So even the early history of pre-World War II suburbanites would use their property for its use value to grow eggs or vegetables, and that's the history of the farmers market in Los Angeles, is people bringing in their goods from the near suburbs, not from really rural areas, but just from their own backyard gardens to sell. We have food trucks certainly that exist, and in a lot of suburban areas where the retail has kind of lost tenants, we might have pop-up markets, swap meets, things like that occur. So I would characterize it always as having been suburban in a sense. So I think it's ongoing. I think one thing that's kind of exciting is some of the research that's being done in kind of micro mobility in freight. So Ellen referred to drone delivery, but in suburbs and in suburban retrofits, there can also be bike trucks. And so instead of like the idling delivery trucks everywhere, having a more central point where things can be put into human-powered local vehicles to make that last delivery and drop off. So I expect to see more of that too.
Mark,
Yeah.
Mark asks, we have ground floor commercial requirements and most of our nodes to retrofit are commercially zoned. Without just doing away with those requirements, have you seen solutions, intentional third places, front on greens, percentage of allowing ground floor residential? If so, do you have any good figures or other ideas related to that? Ellen?
So I think what's more important, it is, you can never you're not going to get retail to survive on every single front. So you need to have a street hierarchy that clearly says, okay, this is going to be our retail street, and maybe this one is destination retail. It's a lot of food and beverage that brings people from outside. Another street is your more everyday retail, grocery, pharmacy, etc. But then recognize that you're going to have other side streets that are not going to be, should not be exclusively for commercial. And so rather than focusing on just how you're zoning the uses, focus on just other ways of activation. And in some cases, it's going to be just, plantings, and it's going to be nice frontages, but not necessarily successful. So there are, I think, a lot of folks. I love David Baker's work, and he and Amanda Loper have done a lot of work on what they call the first 20 feet and how to how they have some pretty diverse examples of ways to activate the first 20 feet up and first 20 feet out from a building.
Just to build
a lot of questions here, running out of time, I see.
I just want to just compliment Mark for asking that question, because I think this is one of these issues where well-meaning planners have required ground floor commercial without, and it's causing more problems than benefits. And I think there's nothing wrong with living on a ground floor, and residential use on a ground floor, even with a minimal setback, can totally be managed by design. And so I would encourage any well-meaning planners out here who think that it's a truism that you can't have ground floor residential and you ought to have ground floor retail to rethink it before it's too late. And it could be live work, it could be certain kinds of apartments and how they're organized in that and designed in that front row.
Nick asks, are cul-de-sac suburbs hopeless for rehabbing? Neighborhood commercial seems unviable. More housing, residents, and traffic congestion at pinch points. It is, where you do not have a connected network of streets, how do you retrofit these suburban cul-de-sac subdivisions?
Finding the example of the connected up cul-de-sacs, that has been the holy grail the entire time that I've been maintaining the database. I'm trying to find examples of former cul-de-sacs that actually, were only separated by often incredibly small distances, but actually connected. extremely rare. So changing the urban form to me is the way to make anything more commercial viable there, to help people. There are plenty of examples of trail connections, but as far as car connections, I do think there are a handful of entire subdivisions that put themselves up for sale because they were just standing in the way of development, and they figured, hey, we'll get a better price if we talk together. Or entire subdivisions that were purchased by developers of cul-de-sac subdivisions because of a new transit line coming and the developer wanting. So those are the rare, very rare, but examples I know of like that.
Anne asks, are there any examples of state enabling legislation or state incentives, June, for suburban retrofit?
Well, I guess it was already the one in California. Was it SB AB 2011 is one very, very promising example. Ellen, do you have others?
Minnesota also. I mean, the
R1 zoning ones. Yeah,
exactly. The challenges to R1 zoning are out there. There are a lot of states and individual cities which are now especially writing the ADU or allowing ADUs or lane housing. I mean, they have different names, but there have been attempts. South Carolina and I forget which other, Georgia actually at one point have made attempts to introduce bills to finance the building of state-funded parking garages at dead mall sites as a way to trigger redevelopment, but none that have passed as far as I know. But there were a couple examples of that. So I think on the funding side is where there's actually probably a little more opportunity to see some of that.
We only have a few minutes left, actually, till 1 o'clock. So try to get to a few more questions. Hazel asks, after the initial hurdle of zoning is cleared to allow complete communities as of right along corridors, what are examples of bundling utilities, mainly water and sewer, to accelerate suburban retrofit? June, do you have thoughts on that?
well, that's what we call it, anticipatory retrofitting. If you're doing one of those projects, and if you're going to be the owner or manager and you anticipate that you might have a cycle 10, 15, 20 years down the line. And I was just hearing about this from Mueller in Austin, which was the huge former airport that's been really fantastically retrofitted into a vibrant, dense, kind of walkable, lots of different housing types. But one of the first things they did in order to generate cash flow was take part of the property and make basically a big box shopping center. And they did put the utilities in trenches rather than this kind of cheapest diagonal point between things, but to anticipate what would be the future streets and already preload all of the infrastructure in those easements and locations, so that when, and they were joking when I was just there last week that it may be about time to go back and consider retrofitting that property or parts of it, and they've already got the utilities well placed to do that. Rows of trees, really thinking about, you're going to put those kinds of things in anyway, so locate them smartly in a kind of urban block-like configuration.
We're almost at the hour. Do you guys have a couple of minutes to go over if we have more questions? You have to be someplace immediately. Okay, we'll keep on asking then.
Great questions, by the way. Can we save the chat here?
Yeah, I want to save it. Yeah,
I think so. Okay, so how does the suburban retrofit approach look like for individuals and small scale developers who don't have the capital or institutional connections? Is this an approach for small developers?
Absolutely, it can be. I mean, I think everybody, there has been a lot of focus on the dead malls and the dead office parks. They're like the glamour categories, but there are the smaller properties that where there's the re-inhabitation projects tend to be extremely important in, let's call them more slow markets that are not able to attract the big large scale redevelopment folks. So turning one of my project I really loved in the back, way back early project, was turning an old Food Lion grocery store into a local library in Denton, Texas. Or turning, it's helping. There's a lot of examples of small scale developers just reusing Monty Anderson's work in South Dallas. He's done a lot of, on the one hand, partnering with the city. There was a strip mall with a dead Ace hardware store. And like a Walmart or somebody wanted to come in, and the mayor was asking Monty, can't we do something better? And so Monty said, all right, we'll partner. I'll buy the space and I'll convert it to all this little incubator small business startup space, but you have to provide the mentorship program to really help these first-time entrepreneurs learn how to fill out all the forms they need to, how to run a business, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of these kinds of, as June and I often use the term, community serving uses, I think in particular, have often been carried out by fairly small scale developers.
Nick asks, is there a certain point where suburban bike lanes never make sense? On the other hand, at what point are suburban bike lanes obvious? June, can you talk about bike lanes and suburban retrofit at all?
Goodness. Well, I think in many suburban settings, in a retrofit, if you slow down the traffic enough, then you can have more of a Sharrow kind of configuration, where bikes, cars, pedestrians can all be more safely navigating together. And then I would say really trying to think about through routes. More and more people who live in suburbs should be commuting by bike if they can. And I think the kinds of street types that NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials, promote and document extensively, where you can see the sections and the details and how to implement them, are advisable. I think there's also the need for bike parking, to really think about the showers that people might need at their destinations, or maybe having bike parking at suburban retail locations. All of these kinds of things. So it's not just the bike path itself, but the destinations and how conducive they are for someone coming by bike. But once you get on the arterials or the corridors, they need to be protected in some way, I think, in order to work. We also need more suburban bikes. I think that can take suburban buses, BRT, that can take bikes on them, and like retrofitting the vehicles themselves, so that you can kind of do a mix to get where you need to go without being reliant on a car.
Yeah, I'm going to hop on this one too, because I admit I am a cyclist, and so a little bit rabid on the topic sometimes. But the e-bikes has absolutely exploded in suburbia, especially amongst the largest group buying e-bikes are over age 60. And there's a real, it's not something, they're not going out on the arterials, but it is enormously, it has real potential, I think, for us. Yes, we need the lanes. We also, the trails. Here in Atlanta, we have a rails to trail big project called the Beltline. Back in 2018, a tech company had outgrown its office space on the Beltline. They surveyed their employees. 30% were walking or biking to work. That's 800 employees in a tech company. And they said, we will quit if you move us off the Beltline. So they built brand new office, doubled their space, but with 30% less parking. It really is. I think a lot of people are totally surprised. This is Atlanta. Nobody thought anybody walked or biked, and trails are huge. And suburbs are not going to be able to build all the roads to interconnect all their large superblock sites, but they can often build trails, especially along creeks. If it's a hilly area, give the easement. There's some brilliant strategies covered in our book that do that.
Once again, I'm gonna remind people that we are going to be posting this video, and so as we continue to ask some more questions, you can go back to the video tomorrow, and I'm sure plenty of people will see it online. Um, so Alex, who is Canadian, asks, is there a backlash to suburban retrofit in the US? For example, sprawl is fine, just get more of it as it was. What's the situation with NIMBYism and suburban retrofit, Ellen?
So there's always been backlash. There's always been folks, and to a certain degree, I mean, the crude thing that we've often joked about is we just need a few more funerals. It's mostly the older population that don't want to see the change. And it's the younger folks moving in who actually are a little more interested in change. So, frankly, and I'm sort of jumping ahead but I do think the Make America Great Again, referring back to kind of the 1950s as a model, is potentially a real reversion back to that notion that, hey, the 1950s suburban model was great for some and not for all. So I'm worried that we will see actually potentially could see even more backlash.
I think one of the things that's odd here, there are some, and I think people have written about this with the YIMBY movement, that it is some strange bedfellows politically. So you could have the kind of anti-regulation, property rights kind of arguments converging with the we need to do something about climate change, energy use, efficiency, affordability kind of mandates that both push against business as usual that has been kind of operating in the mainstream for some time. So there are some interesting, I think, strange confluences that do pop up in certain contexts. So I think pushing more of that is, or at least pushing people to question some of their knee-jerk kinds of reactions that a lot of research also show are driven by fear and anxiety. And that's something that is really challenging, I think, to address in a productive way, I guess. So persistence, I think, is essential, and being armed with good information, compelling examples, and stories of where it has worked can help shift, I think, blocked conversations, because we can't just go back to a previous time. Doesn't work that way.
Who is, I believe, taking part in your symposium and weekend. She said she's looking forward to the Seaside Prize weekend, and her question is, have you encountered or implemented conversions of large houses or McMansions into other building types, shared housing, as June mentioned, apartments, senior housing, or other? June?
I love your drawings of how that could be done. I think when you look at in urban, kind of lower density suburban form urban areas, a lot of that had already happened, certainly in New York and many other cities, that these older houses are actually apartments when you look more closely, although they might still appear to be kind of big houses from the outside. And I think that's not something we've been able to track or follow specifically. I will say, I was in Austin recently, and they've just passed a bill for, I think, allowing up to 4 or 5 units on lots, kind of as of right in the city, and a lot of that will involve taking some of the older houses and by a combination of remodeling and additions, finding ways to convert to multiple units on a single lot where there's still basically one building on the lot. So stay tuned for that, I think, because people are super excited to see the fruits of that policy change in Austin, where there's incredible pressure on the housing market.
Hazel asks, what are some of your favorite examples of privately owned public space standards for larger, greater than 10 acres suburban retrofits sites or projects, Ellen?
So it's always been an interesting topic, actually, because I think a lot at CNU, we want our infrastructure to be public, and the public spaces to truly be public. But we found in many developments, I wouldn't say most, developers choosing to keep them private because they feel they can provide better services, or and really keep the streets clean better than they trust their local government. But Mosaic is a redevelopment in Northern Virginia, where the reason was that they wanted to lower the speed limit on the streets. And if they had allowed them to be public, they would have been posted at 35, even though this was a totally walkable small block development. So it's interesting to get different kinds of reasons. And I think sometimes also on the public spaces, again, sometimes it's just that question of maintenance, but it's also wanting to have the ability to be able to close them in order to have a farmer's market on Saturdays without having to go through bureaucracy. So I've seen good examples where I thought developers were behaving with very good intentions. It was still, and yet in doing that. So leave those.
Question from Stephen: how could local governments prime the pump for redevelopment on these aging shopping centers? And they're all over. June?
Sorry.
How
Repeat.
could local government prime the pump for redevelopment on aging shopping centers?
I'll jump in if you want.
Well, I mean, one of the first things I think it would be to partner with your local metropolitan planning organization and work on trying to find this inventory in a way that it's searchable. So if a developer was looking for an opportunity, like how do they find the opportune property? I think that's also what they're trying to do in San Antonio and in Fort Lauderdale. So it's about setting up a way that a would-be developer can be steered toward the right property rather than knocking their head against the wall because they basically purchased the wrong property to do what it is that they hope are trying to do. And so then if they can be steered towards particular properties, then what the local government can do, I think, is help ease the permitting process. Anything that, we hear this over and over again, anything that can reduce the red tape and expedite approvals is like gold without actually giving any money. It's about reducing the time scale, which is invaluable on many levels. And then there's helping with the pre-development costs and site preparation, those kinds of things. In addition to, there's tax increment financing and other things like that. But I think there's a lot that can be done without having to go down that path.
I just want to ditto everything June said, but also say one of the new trends is actually seeing, especially with the dead mall properties that were bought by a troll developer who's saying they will redevelop the property, but they need the city to reduce their property taxes because it's in such terrible shape right now, and they just bleed it. In response to that, and that's more common than one would like to think, we're seeing cities now becoming the master, buying up the properties back from the troll developers, becoming the master developer themselves, which is not something cities are used to doing, but certainly downtown Westminster, that has won a charter award, but is a great example of that. But there's more and more.
Mhm. Well, I think we have to wrap it up, but let me just ask one last question to each of you. I mean, what's the takeaway you think, that folks out there should be um, should the lesson learned of suburban retrofit right now? What would you add? Is there anything you could add, Ellen, to the conversation that we've had now? Um,
I'll probably think of it 5 minutes from now, but no, right now, this has really been terrific. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, everyone who asked terrific questions. And I mean, I just think I retrofitting suburbia is going to continue. What I hope is we get another generation of researchers who will really take this on. I'm going to be retiring soon, and I really don't know, So I want to encourage. This is not an academic audience, but we need some of you to go into academia and actually really continue. Not just, yes, we need folks doing it, but the fun that June and I get to have is, I think, going into a project 5 years after it was designed and seeing what actually got built, what didn't, why, how it's performing, and then going back to the firm that designed it, and they often don't know really quite what got built and didn't, and performing. And so terrific conversation. So that would be what I would like to see
June,
in the
take
future.
final
I
thoughts, takeaways.
second that, and I also just want to, more researchers, new topics. I want to emphasize something that Peter Calthorpe said in a recent interview. The strip is everywhere, so there's an opportunity. Ellen and I are looking kind of nationally and even globally at this work. We've been doing some work in Australia too, but the strip is everywhere. So there are opportunities very locally, I think, for you to get involved in where you live. And the other thing I would say, I just want to put on the radar here is this upcoming challenge of everything we've built in the wildland urban interface, or the so-called HUI. And by some research, a third of the US population basically lives in the HUI, which is susceptible to wildfire, floods, other kinds of environmental impacts. And this is something we all really need to, I think, be much more attuned to and knowledgeable about, and what that might mean for the retrofitting agenda going forward. And a lot of that has been built just in the past 20, 30 years. So it's really a looming thing.
Well, that sounds like another topic for a whole other on the park bench in the near future. June and Ellen, I want to congratulate you on the Seaside Prize and have a wonderful time in early February at Seaside. I'm jealous. I thank everybody for attending and the excellent questions and the participation. Everybody have a great day, and I'll see you for another On the Park Bench soon.
Thank you, Rob.
Bye.